Okay, Jodie Rubenstein, you should know. Okay, Jodie, first question. How did you get involved in J Street?
Sure. So I actually it started with a trip on Birthright. On the summer between my 2 years of grad school, I went on Birthright, and from the moment I stepped off the plane, I just I grew up in Northern Virginia where there weren't a lot of other Jewish people and not a lot of Jews my age, and to get off the plane and have signs in Hebrew and everyone be Jewish. I mean, really, from the moment I landed, I was in love and not expecting that at all. And then there was another moment further on in the trip where we spent a night in the Bedouin tents, and they had the funny campy Bedouin tents, and they had us walk out into the desert, and we looked out. I mean, they had us walk away from the group, and we're looking up at the stars, and something about that experience, I felt like, while up until that point my Jewish identity hadn't been the most salient thing for me, and Israel hadn't been a huge part of that Jewish identity, all of a sudden I knew that this was a huge part of me, and that this was the land that my grandparents dreamed about in Poland, and that I had to bring my children here, that this was going to be part of my life forever. And so that was kind of the moment. That was a very pivotal moment for me, and deciding that I might want to dedicate my life to pro-Israel work. And I decided maybe within 24 hours that I wanted to live there. So when I finished grad school, I did a Masa program and lived in Israel for 5 months, and then had to come back and get a real job, make some money, but I kept staffing Birthright trips, and I was staffing a Birthright trip in it was January of 2013, so it was after Pillar of Defense in 2012, and someone was speaking to our group. We were at a kibbutz in the north, and the way that someone was asking him why he decides to stay there. He had made aliyah from the States, from Ohio, and someone was asking why he decides to stay, given the security threats. And he said, well, this is my home, and I want to be here, and of course that, everyone deserves to be in a home where they feel safe. But then he said, and what I say is, screw the Arabs overlooking Syria and Lebanon. And I just felt like I knew there was such negativity coming from both sides on this issue, and that if I really wanted Israel to be a place where I could bring my children, if I really want Israel to exist as a Jewish democratic state into the future, that it wasn't going to happen if this is the way people on both sides were talking about the conflict. And so I came home, and I was talking to my parents about it over dinner and expressing my concern, and my parents, who are both activists, said, well, that's great, Jodie, what are you going to do about it? And I said, okay, fine. So I was working as a social worker at the time in New York, but I got connected with, I did a little bit of research and got connected with the J Street organizer in New York, and we had coffee, and she identified pretty quickly that I wanted to get involved, and she said, I've got this Purim event for you to help us organize, and I quickly became the co-chair of the Young Professionals Network in New York, and then that just sort of led to a few months later. I was feeling a little bit, I was doing J Street work with my door closed at my office, and really started thinking more and more about doing it full time, and a job came up with J Street U, and so I decided to move here, and then 2 years after that, still here in a different role, but it's been a really wonderful experience.
Great, and we're going to just pivot here a little bit for a few questions, because this is a very difficult and it is a very challenging time for Israel, and the Jewish community around the world, really. So I want to talk a little bit about J Street's work and kind of get your perspective on that, because I think it's important. And my next question is, Yes, given what is going on right now on the ground in Israel, the territories, the daily attacks on Israelis with knives, guns, vehicles, um, does J Street maintain its focus on the two-state solution, um, on a peaceful resolution to this conflict, when every single day we hear about a stabbing, a shooting, a car ramming, um, and really the focus on a lot of people's minds is just about security. So how does J Street, and what maybe you can say what some of the things you do, but how do you maintain your focus on a long-term solution when you have this daily violence going on?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the security is one of the things that drives me and a lot of folks at J Street the most, is this idea that, I have 6 cousins under the age of 8 who live in Israel. And so every time I see the news, they are who I think about. And so the question for me is, what can I be doing every day to help ensure security for them and for their future? And it is hard given everything that is happening, and it can be very frustrating. But I would say there are 2 things. One, Laura Friedman, who works for Americans for Peace now, she's brilliant and has been working on this issue for a really long time, and she always says that the reason that she works on this issue is because there is a solution. That there isn't, the reason she doesn't work on world hunger, or I think there are many reasons she works on this issue, but unlike something like world hunger, there's an answer, there's a solution, and she knows what it is. And so I have to believe that if we keep at the work we're doing, there is a positive outcome. I know what it could look like, and I feel fortunate that here at J Street, I think there are a lot of people doing a lot of thinking about the role of Americans and American Jews in getting us there, because to not do anything makes me feel so powerless. And there's nothing worse for me than feeling like I'm not part of the solution. I'm not part of moving forward productively. So even whatever's happening there, if there are any actions that I can take, I want to be part of that. And the other thing I'll say is that I think what we're seeing right now is what will continue to happen as long as we don't have a 2-state solution. I mean, to me, this is the nightmare. And whether the solution comes in 1 day or 100 years, the difference will only be the amount of bloodshed. And I hope very sincerely that it is in less than 100 years. But I do believe that a 2-state solution is the only solution.
Is that your vision, and is that J Street's vision? Is an Israel that is Jewish and democratic, at peace with a Palestinian state, living side by side in peace and security? Is that what J Street advocates? Is that what you advocate for, and is that what you'd like to see?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, and what would you say to those in the pro-Israel, some in the pro-Israel Jewish community, who might be somewhat skeptical of J Street's intentions? I'm sure you've heard people talk about J Street that, well, maybe we have a big tent, but I don't know, some people aren't sure if it's big enough for a group like J Street. But what would you say to those who might be skeptical of J Street and their commitment to Israel?
Yeah. I mean, I would say, I think, first, get to know us, read up on our positions. I think that there are a lot of people who, J Street, like other organizations, like things in life, it gets a reputation, and people, it's hearsay. Oh, I've heard this rumor about J Street, I've heard this thing about J Street. When you Google anything, you can get some pretty interesting results. And so I would say read our positions, and then let's have a conversation. I in no way think that everyone in the community is going to agree with J Street's policy positions, but let's make sure that the starting point is what our positions are. And I think along the lines of getting to know.
Okay.
So I think in addition to getting to know the people who represent J Street, I mean, one of those is Jeremy, and Jeremy's grandparents were two of the founders of Tel Aviv, in Petah Tikva. There's no one who's more pro-Israel than Jeremy, and then so many of us here, and I think that the more people get to know who we are and understand that, many organizations in the Jewish community go about pro-Israel advocacy in different ways, and we may differ in how to best get there, but ultimately we want the same thing, and that is a peaceful and secure Jewish and democratic Israel. And so I think just getting to know us, getting to know our positions better.
Okay, great. Let's talk about your background. You were a children's therapist for witnesses and survivors of domestic violence. And does that background, does that give you any insight, perhaps, into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and some of your work at J Street?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I grew up, like I said before, both of my parents are activists, and what my mom always said from a very young age was that no one asks to be born. People are just born into the world, into whatever circumstances they're born into, and I was fortunate enough to be born into circumstances of a lot of privilege. And my parents instilled in me that it was my responsibility, both as a Jew and as a person in the world, to improve the lives of others and to try to equal the playing field the best way I could. And so from a very young age, I knew that, and my parents provided incredible role models for that I wanted to give back in some way. And so that sort of started the trajectory in social work, and I've always loved working with children, and I loved being a children's therapist. But what I found was that the sort of institutional barriers that were facing a lot of my clients, a lot of the people with whom I worked, many of them were undocumented immigrants, many of them were going through domestic violence litigation, and I found that there were so many policy and institutional barriers that, as much as we could do in therapy, there were so many factors that were preventing them from succeeding and from preventing an improvement in their quality of life. And so, when I think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there are a lot of factors that are the same. I mean, I think that we can see the way power and privilege play into the conflict, but mostly it's how can I affect the most change for the most people, and if I see myself in this organization as a player in trying to bring peace to societies of people, and I don't kid myself in thinking that I'm doing that, but to be part of an organization and part of a movement that wants peace for a lot of people, and wants to really improve the lives of as many people as possible, I think that for me is the biggest thread. I always wanted to do that, but in social work it was happening on a much more micro level, and here obviously it's much further removed, but the values are the same in that I want peace and security, and I want people to be able to live freely and happily and safely, on both sides of the conflict.
Great. And tell us a little about, you helped indigenous women and girls in Peru. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I worked at an organization called Salud Sin Límites, which is Health Unlimited. And what we did is we worked in indigenous communities in Peru, near Ayacucho, many of whom, they've lived very much outside of Western culture. I mean, they've grown up without a lot of access, some without access to electricity, and so there are very high rates of infant mortality, maternal mortality rates are very high, and there's also a very high level of sexually transmitted diseases, and there have often been questions like, we send in all these tools, we send in medicines, we send in readings, why aren't people using them? Well, the idea of the work we were doing was that we have to find ways to incorporate Western medicine that we know works into the indigenous culture in a way that makes sense for people. I think one of the best examples for me is this book, The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. It's about a Hmong population in California, and if people don't believe in the medicine, in the treatment, it might not work. It might, but it might not. And so we've just seen through research that if we can incorporate the two together, it just makes for much more successful, culturally competent, but I mean, forget being culturally competent, it works. People will use it and get better. And so I helped organize conferences and education materials for women and girls out in the sort of more rural provinces of Peru.
Great, just a few more questions. Thanks again for your time. You also work with in Israel with refugees from Sudan and Eritrea. Is there anything we can learn here in America about Israel's experience with refugees as we have a debate about the Syrian refugees and a refugee policy here in America?
Well, I think, it's really important as Jews for us to remember, that we were once refugees, after World War II. I mean, my mom's mom came to the U.S., fortunately right before World War II, but all of my grandparents were immigrants. Not all, she was the only one who was born outside the U.S., but all of my great-grandparents were immigrants. The rest of the three were born here. But, I think we as Jews know what it means to be persecuted. And for me, with that self-awareness comes an obligation to help those who are in a similar situation. And, I just saw in that experience of working with the Sudanese and Eritrean women and children, they had been through so much. And, I mean, the stories I heard were just terrifying. And so to the extent that we can say, okay, we as Jews, we are taught that we must help others. And again, it goes back, I think, to the way I was raised or taught by my parents that, they didn't ask to be born in countries with unbelievable political unrest and turmoil and, what we're seeing with Syrian refugees. I also believe that we have an obligation to, embrace people who were unfortunate enough to be born into these circumstances. And obviously security is incredibly important, and we need to make sure that there are measures that are in place that we're keeping ourselves secure. But I think that the kind of Islamophobic rhetoric that has come up recently, I think, is really not helpful in our orientation toward the Middle East period, and I think won't be helpful in getting us toward a two-state solution or a peaceful future in the Middle East.
Okay, last two questions. What is your favorite thing about living in Washington?
Ooh, my favorite thing about living in Washington. Well, what I love is that the sort of bar hangout conversation is political. I mean, that's really dorky, but, when I lived in New York, the kind of bar dinner table conversation was about creative things, and I'm not that creative. Like, I love talking about politics. I love talking about what's going on in the world, and I find that here that's the norm, as opposed to the exception. And I also really love being close to my parents. I mean, we haven't lived in the same city since I was in high school, and so they're just a short metro ride away, which I really love.
Great, and last question. Do you have a favorite pastime, something you really, a hobby, something you really enjoy?
I would say dancing. I started dancing in college, and I mean, I do not say this that I'm a necessarily good dancer, but I started doing just like hip hop, and I was part of a dance troupe, and I choreographed some in college. Shoop by Salt and Peppa being the ultimate performance my senior year, but I'm a certified Zumba instructor. I haven't started teaching a class, but I would say that dancing is something that I really love and would love to make more time for.
Great. Thanks for your time.